Thankfully for her sanity, Friedmont didn't try to make any other attempts at connection, with the only communication between the ships from that point forward being minor detail exchanges for course corrections and things of that nature, which is all too common with ships traveling at light speed together. Friedmont's ship did make several inquiries. However, they were all outright refused, as they were usually about partying or alcohol, inviting members of Exovol's crew over to have a good time before the war effort, which Mika refused fervently. Thankfully, not much else in terms of communication was really necessary. Complete with their destination, the Church of the Dealer had also arranged the meeting between them and the other ship captains who would be heading up the war front, having communicated with them via deep space transmission, that of the encrypted variety, a single-lot transmission that would allow anyone picking it up to take one and only one shot at guessing what the password for the transmission was. If you were unable to guess the 365-character password the very first time, the transmission would refuse you access, as it arrived in an encrypted state. Through this means of communication, the Brotherhood of Stripes was able to tell their ships on the battlefront of the arrival of 2 Category 3 vessels, with both the names of the captains and ships available to them. So, their arrival and the location of it was already pre-planned. Once they showed up on the battlefield, a collection of other captains would meet them for a strategic council of sorts, a meeting to establish what their next course of action was, depending on what was needed at the battlefront. The plans for the battle itself were kept out of the transmission just in case the enemy happened to be able to hack the signal. So, for the remainder of the time that they spent journeying to their destination, which would, at their current rate of speed, amount to several weeks of travel, Mika and their crew did their best to go about their regular lives, trying to socialize when they could, relax, and, in some cases, prepare, making sure that they were overstocked for weaponry. The one thing that they did not need during combat was a shortage of firepower. So, they spent their excess time producing more missiles for the missile arrays, making sure the plasma storage system for the plasma cannons was fully operational and stocked to the absolute maximum, with plenty of backup in store. They even managed to double the shield relays. The shield relays themselves were part of how the shield functioned. You see, each relay acted like its own energy emitter, sending off a small portion of the overall shield energy. The more relays you have, the more powerful the shield you produce is. However, this also dramatically increases the energy cost for those shields, doubling that as well. But with 2 quantum drives on board, energy was not an issue, so their shields were now far above the standard, and able to take a significant amount of impact force out of basically anything. Exovol's ability to quickly alter its own physical makeup was making itself worthwhile in spades. Meanwhile, part of the time, the recreations room had been converted into somewhat of a training facility, or that was at least one of its functions, in which detailed holographic projections and interactive equipment allowed them to practice combat maneuvers, techniques, and different strategies for what to do while in combat, helping their teamwork for the primary bridge crew, all of which was actually Dolus's idea. In fact, the entire thing effectively played much like a video game that had multiple people fulfilling different jobs in order for everything to function properly, as it would on a normal starship. Their ability to work together had begun to dramatically improve. They were actually currently running one of these simulations, just finishing it up in fact. A 3-on-1 combat simulation against 3 Tier 1 ships. A simulation which ended, of course, with the victory of the exovol, due in no small part to the piloting of Vermi. Most other people performed their job very strategically, in a by-the-book sort of manner, the same way you'd expect anyone else to. However, Vermi was an entirely different story. He had an unorthodox and in-your-face style of combat when it came to piloting the ship. At first, Mika thought that it might be a problem, a very serious one, as Vermi would make these odd requests for specific alterations to attack and defenses, which at first she refused outright, which of course frustrated Vermi. But despite the refusal, he would go along with the demands of performing more mundane maneuvers. But Vermi was very persistent, insisting that he should be taken seriously, that simply because he's only piloting the ship, that doesn't mean they shouldn't listen to him. That being the pilot of the ship was actually a very powerful strategic place for making combat maneuvers and strategic pinpoint attacks. After a great deal of arguing, they finally agreed to give Vermi a chance, which everyone expected to end in disaster. However, quite contrary to it, they found that the requests that Vermi made would often have devastating effects against the enemy combatants in the programs, allowing them to deliver devastating blows at minimal risk to the ship by combining an advanced and unorthodox piloting maneuver with a pinpoint shift in attack and defense. In one test after another, Vermi showed without question that if he got a wild hair up his ass, that they should suddenly listen to him, that he was going to do something crazy and he wanted everyone else to follow along. It would be a very good idea to listen. In one of the simulations, Vermi actually requested that a third of the missiles in the arsenal be, well, ejected into space on his command. Not fired, but instead that the room in which the missiles were held be evacuated and the emergency latch opened, sending all of the missiles out into space, unarmed and undetonated, unfired. And brilliantly, Vermi somehow turned this into, well, a stroke of blind brilliance, pulling a fast maneuver between 3 oncoming ships in attack formation. He pulled their vessels spiraling through the mix at a high rate of speed through the formation whilst opening the latch, allowing all of the missiles in the inventory space to be released into space, which there were hundreds of them, which at first seemed pointless, as even if the missiles made contact with the other ships, they wouldn't detonate, and all the other ships had to do was not shoot them, which is where the final turn in Vermi's strategy came into play. After leaving behind this hailstorm of undetonated missiles before the enemy could strategize, think about it, or make any evasive actions, their rear weapons assortment would target a single missile that had been affixed with a tracking beacon. Fire on that one, and the missiles were all still in close enough proximity that upon its detonation, the rest of the missiles went off. It was a massive chain of explosions that affected all 3 of the oncoming vessels, damaging all of them severely. It was impossible to fire that number of missiles from the ship, even with all the missile ports. Having that amount of attack that fast was simply undoable. Well, at least under normal circumstances. But Vermi found a way to pull it off, and with some clever piloting behind it, the move proved devastating to the enemy ships, and amounted to a one-off victory in Exovol's favor, with minimal damage to the ship for show. In all of the countless tests that they were beginning to run, more and more it was showing that relying on Vermi for a quick plan of action in unorthodox ways would prove highly advantageous in the future.